All right, well, we have quite a few participants, so why don't we go ahead and get started. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the hidden values of rangeland and farmland. My name is Alyssa Rowland, and I'm the Communications Director for the California Rangeland Trust, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Before we get started, I want to quickly run through some logistics to help make this a good experience for everyone. So we've gone ahead and muted all participants, so no need to do that. If you would like to ask a question, we welcome you to do so by going to the control panel on your screen. There you'll see a question and answer section. Click on the square to pop that out and go ahead and type in your comments and your questions in there, and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. I also want to add that we are recording this webinar, and we will go ahead and send out a link to those registered following the program. So leading this webinar today, we have Kara Heckert, California Regional Director for the American Farmland Trust, and Michael Delbar, CEO of the California Rangeland Trust. And so at this time, I will turn it over to Kara and Michael to kick things off.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Kara Heckert. I'm the Regional Director for California for American Farmland Trust. And thanks to everyone for joining us in this conversation today about the multiple benefits that California's farms and ranches provide our state and the nation. Just one example of those benefits, and you will hear several more today, is the California Department of Food and Agriculture's most recent agricultural economic statistics report, which states that California's 69,400 farms and ranches had total cash receipts of over $50 billion and exports of $21 billion. But at the same time, we continue to lose 50,000 acres of farm and ranch land every year, much of it our most productive. That tells us that we need to do more to demonstrate the benefits, economic and environmental, that our agricultural lands provide. And that's what we hope to do today. And with that, I'd like to pass it off to California Rangeland Trust, our partner in this webinar, and to Michael Delbar, the CEO for California Rangeland Trust, to talk about what we'll be covering today. Michael?
Thank you, Kara, and thank you everybody in the team at American Farmland Trust for your valuable partnership in this effort. So as Kara said, I'm Michael Delbar. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Rangeland Trust. And the conservation of working landscapes and the benefits they provide is an inclusive, all-hands effort to make protecting these valuable landscapes a success. Today, we're excited to share with you the results from the California Rangeland Trust's Ecosystem Services Study and the American Farmland Trust's Farms Under Threat, the state of the state's research, as well as discuss state-level policies that can help protect California's agricultural lands for generations to come. So the California Rangeland Trust was founded 22 years ago by the California Cattlemen's Association. At the time, there were limited organizations that really understood the ranching business. And if a landowner is going to enter into a perpetual conservation contract, then they usually want to do that with an organization that really understands the ranching business. So the thought was there might be a handful of ranchers in the state interested in doing a conservation easement. Now fast forward 22 years, and the California Rangeland Trust is the largest California land trust with 343,000 acres conserved permanently across the state, from San Diego County to Siskiyou County, from the Nevada border to the Pacific Ocean. So I want to start this off with asking you a question. What ecosystem services do you get from rangelands? Is it A, provisioning services, such as food and water, regulating services like climate regulation, pollination, nutrient cycling, habitat services like life cycle maintenance, biodiversity maintenance, cultural services, aesthetics, open space, recreation, or is it all of the above? So we'll give you a second to choose your right answer there. Well, it looks like we have unanimous consent that it's all of the above. Everybody got that one right. So we know that with these ecosystem services are valuable, and what we do in protecting these resources has an extreme value. But how do you explain that? How do you tell somebody, particularly policymakers, that what we are doing has a huge, enormous value without being able to quantify that? So we commissioned, with the help of a couple very generous donors, a study through UC Berkeley to look at just that, how to monetize these values of ecosystem services and the return on investment that public dollars are going into purchasing these easements. So the ecosystem services, like we just discussed, are those goods and services that are produced in nature. And we looked at, UC Berkeley just looked at they looked at 2 different methodologies to determine these values: the traditional benefit transfer approach and the global average approach. The traditional benefits approach is the one that's most applicable to California. There were 9 existing studies out there that really had information that was transferable to California. So they focused on those 9 and applied those to 56 of the Rangeland Trust easements, which accounted for 306,000 acres of our portfolio. And they looked at each of those individual ranches in a 50-mile radius around each ranch. That 50-mile radius was determined to be a day trip, or for folks in that area, or properties that they are familiar with, but they drive by it on a commute to work. And that it really is an effort to determine what is that value for them. The global average approach was looking at that data that exists everywhere. And that produced a per acre value for 3 biomes: the grasslands, woodlands, and forest lands. So we looked at what they determined that because the ecosystem service values are values to people from nature, the researchers expected that the values of these ecosystem services within California would be much higher than that global average approach. So the traditional benefits method only includes those system values that the researchers think can be clearly transferred to California. So our key findings from this study. So using those 2 approaches, the researchers looked at 2 aspects. One is the return on investment. So they looked at 3 different scenarios for that return on investment. One is looking at the highest and best use per the appraisal of the property when it was acquired for an easement. And that is typically used as grazing land. Then they looked at the maximum development under the current zoning. What would happen if that ranch was not conserved and it was developed to the greatest extent possible with the current zoning restrictions? And then the third scenario was, what if that property was fully developed? Take the zoning out of the question and just look at fullest extent possible. But we know that the 2 bookends don't really give us a valuable number, because both are the extremes. So what is the most applicable here is the maximum development under the current zoning. And using that traditional benefit approach, they determined that the return on investment for every dollar into the acquisition of those easements returned $3.47. Pretty darn good return. So then they looked at what is the value of those ecosystem services produced each year. That open space, that food and fiber production, that wildlife habitat, and all those we talked about earlier. So that where they determined that on an annual basis, the return to folks, the value to folks in California was $1.44 billion. That number just blew us away. And that really showed us what we all knew, that protecting these lands is an extreme value to everybody. So those are our key findings, that these ecosystem services, again, produced $1.44 billion a year. Now, one thing that the researchers did not include in this was the value of fire fuel reduction, because that information didn't exist. Now that's no pun intended, a hot topic in California this year, obviously. We all know that grazing animals provide a great resource and a great utilization of those biofuels and turning those into food and fiber. But the value of that from an ecosystem services standpoint doesn't exist in existing studies. So that wasn't included in this. We know that if we were able to have that study done, that $1.44 billion would be a very low number if you add that in. And then of course the $3, nearly $3.50 for every dollar invested, that's again an incredible return. So the bottom line here from all of this is that conserving California's private rangelands is a good investment. I'd even say a great investment. And it's vital to protecting our ecosystem services and the benefits they provide to society. So with that, I would like to introduce Mitch Hunter from the American Farmland Trust to talk about their study. Mitch?
All right, thanks, Michael. And hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Again, my name is Mitch Hunter. I'm the research director for AFT, and I'm based in St. Paul, Minnesota. First, I just want to say that's a really fascinating analysis from California Rangeland Trust and the folks at Berkeley. And I just find it so powerful, the work that the Rangeland Trust is doing to protect working ranches and all the benefits that they provide. It's actually pretty near and dear to me because I spent a couple of years working on a ranch in Eastern California during college, and that was an awesome time. So I'm actually here today to tell you about the flip side of what CRT has been talking about. They're protecting land, right, and saving all those benefits. But the fact of the matter is that we are still converting land out of agriculture to more developed uses where we lose those benefits, whether that's houses, shopping malls, etc. So that's what I'll be talking about. That's an issue that AFT has worked on for 40 years now. To get started, I'm going to run this poll that's on the screen now, just to get a sense of what you all think. So really the question is between traditional urban and suburban conversion and low density residential conversion, such as ex-urban developments and farmettes, which do you think claimed more agricultural land between 2001 and 2016? Okay, that's very interesting. We got 27% that say traditional urban and suburban, 73% that say low density residential. Well, we have some numbers for you on that, and I'll be sharing them later on in the talk. So just remember what it was that you thought and what the group was thinking. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. And again, we have just analyzed this conversion. It's part of a multi-year project that we call Farms Under Threat. And our latest report, Farms Under Threat, the State of the States, was just released in May. So here you can see the report cover for that work, as well as the website link. I'll be talking a bit more about that later, but I encourage everyone to access that information. There's a lot of depth and interesting stuff to dig into. Next slide. So our approach to this work overall is that we used spatial mapping to identify the threats to agricultural land. We did an in-depth analysis of state-level policy responses, and then we brought this research together to try to raise public awareness, inform state and federal policy, and ultimately encourage more direct and permanent agricultural land protection. Today I'll focus mostly on the spatial analysis, and if we go to the next slide, I can tell you how we did that. Before I do so, I want to give a big shout out to our friends at Conservation Science Partners. Actually, one of their headquarters is in Truckee. They led the technical analysis, and this work really would not have been possible without them. We did our spatial modeling in 3 basic steps. The first was to use advanced tools to map agricultural land use at 10-meter resolution across the lower 48 states. And this resulted in the most comprehensive spatial analysis of US agricultural land ever conducted. Second, we identified the best agricultural lands for producing food and other crops. We did this by creating the first ever index of agricultural land quality that explicitly accounts for productivity, versatility, and resiliency. So we call it the PVR index. And finally, we mapped the conversion of agricultural lands to more developed uses from 2001 to 2016. Next slide. We mapped conversion to 2 types of land use, and the first is called urban and highly developed. or UHD, and we identified this using satellite remote sensing. The category includes kind of the traditional culprits of farmland conversion, expanding residential, commercial, and industrial areas. And it's largely found in and around cities and towns, not too surprisingly. But this category also includes rural, industrial, and energy production sites, such as oil and gas well pads, and even solar panel installations, because to a satellite, all of those look about the same as a parking lot or a big box store. Okay, the second type of conversion on the next slide is one that Farms Under Threat is mapping for the very first time. We call it low density residential land use, or LDR. And we undertook this analysis to help identify the impacts of large lot housing on the agricultural land base. These impacts are typically not captured in the traditional urban category, but we know that they're really important. And we found that these LDR areas range from lower density subdivisions to rural areas where more and more houses are being built kind of one by one, to the point where ultimately there's a pretty high housing density. And typically this kind of scattered large lot housing fragments the agricultural land base and limits the production, marketing, and management options for the working farms and ranches that remain in the area. So, I mean, in short, when a lot of non-farm neighbors move in, it just gets harder to farm. Next slide. I'm about to share what we found for California, but I want to say that there's so much more than what I can share today available on our website. So I really encourage you to go check it out. The web address is there on the screen, and it's quite interactive. You can zoom in on the map to a great level of detail. And it also, as you go, brings up different summary statistics on the left side of the page. There's 5 different spatial layers that you can look at. And then there's a whole section of the website touching on our policy findings, which I don't have time to go into today, but they're pretty fascinating, very in-depth, and it's a great way to compare what's going on in California to what's happening in other states around the country, and to learn more about the ways that California can improve. California has lots of great policies, but like every state in the nation, can continue to make progress. All right, so here are the findings for California. We found that development continues to threaten California's ag land. So from 2001 to 2016, California converted 466,000 acres of agricultural land. And out of that total, the main focus of our webinar today, about 280,000 acres were rangeland and pasture land. So kind of contrary to what you all thought, urban conversion is still the leading cause in California. But low density is a big threat. So we found out of the total acreage that it was kind of a 2-to-1 ratio between urban and highly developed conversion and low density residential. And that might have a bit to do with definitions. You know, where do you make the split between the suburbs and the exurbs, or between dense and not dense? In this data set, the split is basically 1-acre house lots. If it's 1-acre house lots, it's probably considered in that urban category. Anything less dense than that is most likely in the low density residential category, as a rough rule of thumb. And we can explore that more too in the Q&A later, if that's something that people are interested in. And all of these findings are summarized in this one key map. The red areas on the map show where conversion has occurred, whether that's to the urban category or to low density residential, from 2001 to 2016. And you can see that the conversion tends to wrap around existing cities and towns, although there are also areas where conversion extends far into the countryside. And this is especially true of that low density residential conversion. Now, we know that when agricultural land is converted, it not only threatens our food supply, it also makes it harder for farmers and ranchers, and especially new producers, to access the land that they need to farm. And very relevant to what we're talking about today, it also jeopardizes all the environmental benefits that well-managed farmland and ranchland can provide, whether that's clean water and wildlife habitat, or carbon sequestration, or, as Michael was mentioning, you know, dealing with the wildfire fuel load. So we wanted to build off the analysis that California Rangeland Trust has done And when we did, it really turns out that losing or the conversion of this land loses ecosystem services that adds up to real money. In short, the recent rangeland conversion is making Californians poorer, environmentally speaking. And it costs specifically Californians $1.5 billion in ecosystem services every year. $1.5 billion a year. Now, of course, that only accounts for this one little window of conversion from 2001 to 2016. If you went back further, the number would be much higher. And just briefly, we came to that number, that estimate, by comparing our conversion findings to what California Rangeland Trust found from their study. We documented slightly fewer acres that were converted compared to what the acres that were included in the CRT study. But the vast majority of those converted acres are located right near cities. And if you remember, Michael was talking about the 50-mile radius. Well, most of those acres are right in a 50-mile radius for thousands and thousands of people. So the cost, the losses to those people would be kind of multiplied. Okay, next slide. Just to put this in a little bit bigger context, of course, AFT's mission covers all of agriculture, including rangeland, pastureland, and cropland. And so I need to talk about cropland briefly. We don't have the equivalent valuation for cropland in California. The studies that we would need to build on are not as widely available. But we do know that we converted 184,000 acres of cropland in California, and that on a pure economic basis alone, that land is probably producing around $690 million in annual revenue. So you have that benefit off the bat. And then there would be so many other benefits related to filtering water, groundwater recharge, potentially carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat, you know, all the ways that well-managed cropland as well can benefit the environment. I know I don't need to tell a group of Californians how important your cropland is to feeding the country and the world, so I won't get into that, but that's kind of another really critical benefit that we're not addressing here. And with that, that's all I have to say for now, but I'm excited to answer some questions later on, so thanks.
Great, Mitch. This is where we're going to jump in for the policy discussion. So appreciate folks coming in and talking about, you know, the real things that are happening on the ground, the things that we've learned about, but also what can we do about that. So today, AFT and CRT, you know, have this wonderful, you know, opportunity to partner and to share some of our visions for policy engagement over the next several months and probably years, as our organizations are really committed to the long-term success of these options. Both CRT and AFT will be just focusing on those land protection policies here, and we do that at the state and federal levels, but it's important to know that AFT has a broader sweep of policy issues that we address on land stewardship issues and our next generation of farmers issues as well. But today we're just going to be focused on the land protection side of things. But before we jump into the discussion, here we go for another poll. And so Alyssa's going to put that up for us. We're going to talk about which state do you think ranked the highest in per capita investment in permanently protecting agricultural land through 2017. Do you think it's Delaware, Texas, California, or Maine? These polls are always fun because we get it, you know, everybody nailed the first one, 100%.
And there's no Googling it either here.
Yeah. There have been hints in the links. Ooh, look at that. Oh, I need to write those down. Give me one moment here. 14, 19, 38, and 30%. All right, folks, hate to disappoint you. Delaware invests $6.03 per capita. Texas is less than 1 cent. That's 1 penny per capita. California is 11 cents per capita, and Maine cents per capita. So as you can see, Delaware is our top performer across the nation, and California has a lot of headway to improve upon that number. All right, next slide. So American Farmland Trust, you know, in its Farms Under Threat release, is really drilled into these being our commitment as we progress forward in farmland protection and conservation. Many of these we've talked about on our previous webinars, but establishing the National Ag Land Network is one of the critical steps that we've taken moving forward, and that is actionable and in play right now. And we have several members from California, including Department of Conservation, on the advisory committee. And that's where we can, you know, really establish new concepts and ground truth areas that really need exploring to advance land protection strategies now and into the future. New leadership in key locations, protecting more farmland ourselves with our partners, and that's looking at new strategic land conservation projects, advocating for strong state and federal policies, and we're going to talk a lot about the state side of that puzzle, but American Farmland Trust has a federal policy shop, and we do engage in federal farm bill and other relevant topics at the federal level, and promoting research-based decision making. And you know, Mitch and his shop is a big part of, you know, the research, you know, that goes into American Farmland Trust. We can switch slide.
So I'll pick it up at this point. Thanks, Katie. So the California Rangeland Trust, our mission is to conserve the working lands and all my notes are messed up here. We support the landowners and encourage sustainable practices and serve as a voice for and an advocate for the preservation of our working rangelands. Our board adopted a strategic plan a couple of years ago, and the two top key priority areas in that strategic plan were to conserve the land and change the thinking. And I mentioned that we had 343,000 acres under easement across the state, ranging from 32-acre easement for mitigation purposes for the California tiger salamander in the Bay Area to the 80,000-acre Hearst Ranch. So what I did not tell you is that we have over 200,000 acres waiting to be conserved, representing 72 ranching families. Those are families that have decided to take the step to permanently protect those ranches. Those are applications that have been accepted by our board and simply just awaiting conservation. They're awaiting conservation because we are looking for the funding to make that happen. And as Katie said, with California spending only 11 cents per capita, that's really shows you the need out there for us to conserve these and with more funding and stable funding sources. The other part that our board really is taking an advance on is change the thinking. We want to showcase the social, cultural, and economic and environmental benefits provided by the working rangelands in California. And that's what led us to one big start, and that is this ecosystem services study. But it all comes down to how do we make this a success? How do we protect these working lands, not just that California Rangeland Trust is doing, or American Farmland Trust is trying to do, but all of the land trusts in the state. So what can we do? So we mentioned the different funding sources, and these are the two of them here that we'll talk about briefly here are real important ones. And the Rangeland Trust has been utilizing the Sustainable Agricultural Land Conservation Program through the Department of Conservation. This has been a very important program for us. It's a relatively new program in the scope of things. It's funded through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and allocated through the Strategic Growth Council of the state of California. This funding source is dependent upon those auction proceeds from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Funds. That's taken a little bit of a dip, and that gives us some cause for concern, because since 2015, that program has funded, as you can see, 100 easements in 36 counties and 112,000 acres. This is a big funding pot for us because it's also used as a matching funds for other funding programs, whether on the state side or, more importantly, is federal funds through the Farm Bill. We're able to use funds or other state funds as a match to bring in dollar for dollar funds from Washington, D.C. into the state. So that's a very important aspect of this, is that matching ability. If we don't have that, we're going to lose out on those federal funds as well. Katie, if you want to talk more about the Farmland Conservation Program.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. These conservation programs that the state puts up is heavily dependent on the Natural Resources Conservation Service, dollars from USDA that comes in. And so I mentioned, part of our federal, shop, this is one of the main priorities that we have in terms of, looking at the flexibility of this program. And it's important to also note that Department of Conservation is mindful and working with some of those partners. I think Elizabeth is actually on the webinar today too from NRCS. Thank you. And looking at how do we create more workable avenues where these programs fit together in terms of application, from one project approval to, the match for, sourcing and funding for that. So that's really been an important aspect and shows that California has a strong partnership here. The California Farmland Conservancy Program has been funded over the years, mostly by proposition, and it's very early, nascent days, it was funded by general funds. Long gone have the days been, from general funds going into supporting and funding this type of work. And that creates a bigger challenge for organizations like ours and many of you that are on the webinar today in looking at how can we secure this funding source. Natural resource conservation work is typically done through bond measures, and we did have a possibility of one of those being put up last year. The governor was even recommending one from his administration, which was a little bit unusual, but was welcomed by folks so long as they, brought in, all the important aspects. And one of those was land conservation. But we all know what happened in March, and we're all, continuing to recalibrate from that point in time. But we do know that if we are to create secure funding sources, we need to be looking more creatively. We also have to address the real elephant in the room, which is GGRF, and which is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and the cap and trade activity and how it reacted, during this COVID and economic crisis. And with the absence of, strong and stable funding sources, this good work that we're seeing here and the progress on that good work could be in jeopardy. So we need to be thinking about, what can we do from a long-term perspective that aligns with, new state directives around the executive order by the governor and conserving 30% of California's lands, which include ocean waters and habitat lands, working lands, the whole kit and caboodle there. And what does that mean? And how can we, really put our collaborative dollars, in play to help support that effort? And there's a lot that's still unknown, and with the executive order and what that will mean for us going forward. But you can guarantee that, Michael's organization, our own, we will be engaged in trying to find the best ways and methods forward so we can create, again, that stability and growth in these programs, because they have proven both from an ecosystems perspective and from a community benefit perspective, not just for agricultural economy, bottom line, family farmer, but from the broader community perspective, that these are valuable lands to invest in, and they are one of a kind, and we can't replace them. So I think that's all I have on our segment, Michael.
I just want to add, Katie, that on the WCB, the Wildlife Conservation Board funding, those programs provided a lot of very valuable funding earlier on, 10, 15 more years ago. Those earlier bond measures really had a focus on agricultural land conservation. That focus has not been there to the same extent in these latter bonds. So as we look at these new bonds hopefully coming out, if we can really take a look at those existing programs that work. They work for the Department for Fish and Wildlife, they work for the landowners, they work for the Land Trust. They're easy, they're quick to get out on the ground, and they do the job of conserving these working lands very efficiently and effectively. So
that's a good point. Prop 68 was key in getting that moving forward on WCB and also CFCP. Thank you for bringing up that salient point.
And then you mentioned the NRCS ASAP AO program. Again, that's is a very valuable program. We worked hard to, along with American Farmland Trust on the federal side, to make sure that that was tweaked in a way that works best for landowners, and we're very happy with this new farm bill. And it's just, we need to continue to access those funds. I think we can bring in more dollars from Washington into California if we have more matching dollars to show that demand.
Agreed.
All right, well, I think we're ready for some questions. So panelists, I'm gonna ask you to all unmute yourselves. And we will go ahead and open things up. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the question box and we will get those answered. We'll start off with this one and we'll pass it to Mitch. Mitch, can you please confirm that the urban and high density category included housing lots up to 1 acre in size?
Yes, and that's a great question. It did include housing lots up to 1 acre in size. The line is not a bright, hard line. What we did was use data from the federal government, land cover data, again, going back to satellite data. And that data has a cutoff of about, 1 acre house lots that it will consider to be part of an urban or developed area. And then we had to come up with our own method to go beyond that and look at that low density residential land use as well. And that was new. That was very innovative and new because it's really hard to map that in a consistent way across the country using a satellite. It just doesn't necessarily show up. If there's a few buildings scattered around an open space, are those houses? Are they farm buildings? Who knows? You can't really tell. So we had to kind of get at that from with a little workaround using census data to understand. And so those two categories kind of start to overlap, but not that we're double counting, but they butt up against each other at that point of about 1 acre house lots.
Great, thank you, Mitch. Michael, we'll throw this question to you. Can you elaborate on how the values were assigned to some of the less tangible categories of ecosystem services, such as wildlife habitat, aesthetics, etc.?
I'll take a stab at it because I wasn't one of the researchers. But what the researchers did do is they looked at existing data that was out there setting these values. And they looked at quite a bit of existing data. They didn't create anything new. So they looked at what has already been determined and focused again on what was most applicable to California. So the specifics on how they did that, I'd have to refer back to the study or to the researchers to really understand that one.
Just wanted to add one point on that front, which is, the researchers, not that I was one of them, but having talked to them and looked into it, we're limited by the data that's out there. So if anything, the numbers that Michael shared and that we built off of are an underestimate, because in some cases, there just aren't enough studies to give you a value for, something like, what's a good example? Flood regulation in pastures, let's say, or because there's so many different ecosystem services that could be studied, not every one of them has a study behind it. So there's some gaps. And if we filled in those gaps, those values would not be zero, they would be real values, and you'd add it up to an even higher level of ecosystem service benefits coming from these lands. So this is basically doing the best we can and a really great job with all the research that's out there, but there's always more of those gaps to fill in too.
Thank you, Mitch. We will throw this one to Katie and Michael. Katie, we'll start with you. As a law student who is passionate about helping and promoting agriculture, I have faced a lot of pushback from my peers that are interested in environmental law. CRT and AFT are prime examples of how agriculture isn't always at odds with environmental protections. Do any of you have any suggestions on how to effectively communicate that with my peers who often have negative connotations associated with agriculture?
Yeah, that's my life's mission right there. This is wonderful. Thank you, Abby, for the question. And you know, I think American Farmland Trust and certainly a number of other great organizations, including CRT at the table here, really strive to, you know, create bridges, you know, that and demonstrate that through, you know, real technical groundwork. You know, American Farmland Trust is an organization that has a deep, rich history in, you know, and really initiated the conservation movement with agriculture. And we have, you know, so many times demonstrated that through our engagement in the Farm Bill as a national organization. And as we, you know, continue to do this work, you know, over it's our 40-year anniversary, we continue to face these challenges in every room, you know, and I've seen it with different agencies, you know, that we partner with, that maybe somebody comes in with a strong connotation about agriculture being a certain way, but every day I think it's our mission to show that we are doing it differently, and we do know a lot of growers that are just willing to, you know, try different things, you know, trying to, you know, figure out how to balance, you know, water needs on their property along with climate needs. And we have some really great case studies, you know, that are, you know, we can point people in those directions and just show that it can be economically viable to do natural resource, you know, type of projects and not have them be in contention with the main agricultural operation. These things can all, you know, work harmoniously together. And I know that sounds a little pie in the sky and just like, you know, doe-eyed here about, you know, these things working, but it's true. And many of the big or environmental organizations are at the table, and they are very interested in agriculture and the success of agriculture. And they recognize that the private ownership and operation and management on agricultural lands are key to a lot of their priorities. And so we're starting to see a lot of engagement. And again, you know, we're in this nice middle place where we can engage with, you know, the agricultural side of the world and the environmental side of the world, and bring these things together and really, you know, tell the story and help to get more awareness to that. We have a great comms manager. You might see her name, Teresa O'Connor, on the line here. And that's, you know, part of our mission is, you know, making sure that people understand, you know, that these things do work really well together. Michael?
That's a great answer, Katie, and Abby, thank you for that, because you've hit on an age-old problem, frankly, is how do we tell our story? And that's one of the reasons why our board made that part of our strategic plan is to change that thinking. Get out there and tell that story. Our landowners are thrilled to have folks out, show them what we're doing. And the fact that we have 343,000 acres that represents 70 some odd landowners and another 200,000 plus waiting to permanently conserve it, that tells a story right there. These are landowners that want to do what's best for that land. And it's a tough row to hoe sometimes with folks that have a preconceived notion, but getting them out on the land and showing them, find a farmer or rancher that would like to tell their story. And we're doing more and more of that. We have a tour program where we take folks out and show them what's going on the land. And we really see folks' attitudes completely change when they spend the day out on one of our working ranches. So could be a tough challenge, Abby, but you are a person I know that can tell that story well.
Great, thank you, Michael and Katie. Kara, let's start with you on this question. Is regenerative agriculture a part of AFT's thinking and considerations?
Definitely, absolutely. We have a three-part mission that I should have mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. I think we're most known for farmland protection work in California, but our other two parts of our mission are to promote environmentally sound farming practices and to support the next generation of farmers. And we actually have a large-scale initiative starting up next month in the San Joaquin Valley called the San Joaquin Land and Water Strategy. And we're working with local partners to implement regenerative agricultural practices on 100,000 acres. And we have projects like that all over the country. We have deeply experienced climate scientists and soil health scientists on staff. We don't feel that if you don't steward the land well, but you only protect it, you're missing a really big opportunity to add all these additional values. So absolutely, AFT is based in regenerative ag thinking. And you know, the terminology, I just have to say, the terminology changes from year to year. So I think that's a lot. Regenerative ag is the buzz right now, but you could call that soil and water conservation practices. You could call that soil health. To me, I consider it all pretty much the same thing.
Thank you, Kara. Mitch, we have a question here for you. I'm seeing a lot of low density development in my area. Why do you think that urban conversion was a greater threat in California?
Yeah, really important question. You know, California is a giant and geographically diverse state. So I think it really is going to depend where you are. And we saw patterns nationally that I think also mapped to parts of California. So what I've seen, and this is just my anecdotal report from having spent a lot of time looking at our maps, for instance, in the Central Valley, right around cities like Fresno, there's a lot of urban and highly developed conversion going on. And that land is flat, it's relatively open, it's easy to develop a contiguous subdivision, and it's also not maybe the highest amenity value land in many cases for what a homeowner would be looking for. So that's the sort of area where there's a lot of population pressure. It's easier to develop a more contiguous dense subdivision. And so we're having that kind of urban conversion. Other parts of the state, and this is true of the rest of the country again as well, where the landscape is more varied and diverse, where you have forests, where you have more topography, it's prettier basically, and it's harder to just take one big chunk of land and build one subdivision. That's where we're seeing more of that low density residential type conversion. That might be particularly true in rangeland areas. I mean, ranching country, especially in California, is usually gorgeous country. And so it draws people in to want to live there. I don't know if that's true in this case, but that's a pattern that I feel pretty confident is driving some of these differences around the country. It just so happens that California has a huge amount of population pressure and a lot of that flat land adjacent to cities. And so it's having a lot of that dense development as well.
Mitch, I think that's a great point in the sense of, you know, the Central Valley and what Kara was alluding to in terms of our work there. You know, with the San Joaquin Land Water Strategy, we just did a webinar on our project prioritization tool. And so AFT, you know, we're getting in this kind of micro space and looking at the nexus between planning around agriculture and what does that mean for the multi-benefits a community could be going after or looking at, because a lot of those things have been very two-dimensional in terms of, you know, we need economic growth, and so therefore in houses, so we're just going to build out this way without really, you know, considering what is the opportunity cost, you know, at stake with maybe changing slightly the orientation of that growth. Maybe instead of going west, you know, we should be going east because of the soil quality or the ability to do recharge work or special species considerations, things like that that haven't traditionally been brought up in the comprehensive planning, you know, mindset in my view. And I think that's something that AFT has really been trying to put our best foot forward and, you know, start conversations around, you know, what could development look like, especially with, you know, communities in the Central Valley that are re-engaging around their general plan. And how do we, you know, really look to those things when, you know, there is a high-speed rail, you know, project happening. We're in the midst of a pandemic where people are working very remotely. So we may start seeing growth occurring in other places of the state that we didn't anticipate because people aren't tethered to a certain geographic mega region, for example. So I think that these are all really important factors for folks to be considering, you know, in the space as we look at this bigger underlying, you know, land use question of planning around agriculture.
Thank you. Okay, next question. We will pass it to Michael. Did you find higher returns on investment for ranches closer to large towns or cities versus return on investments in remote locations, generally speaking?
Generally speaking, the answer is yes. Those values tended to be higher. When the researchers looked again at a 50-mile radius around these 56 ranches, So most of those tended to be a little closer to urban areas or towns and cities than others, but they did find in a general sense, those values were higher. In fact, one of the things that the researchers suggested is that we use that data to prioritize the conservation of those lands that are higher, that are more at risk, and those closer to those urban areas.
Thanks, Michael. This question is for either Michael, Kara, or Katie, whoever wants to take a stab at it first. But has either organization thought about a predictable, sustainable funding source for conservation work in California?
I'll take a stab at that. Not knowing what the questioner means by conservation work. So I'm assuming we're talking about farmland conservation, rangeland conservation, and so I'll speak to that. But and Katie, feel free to add, Michael. AFT really helped create the California Farmland Conservancy program back in the 90s with the Department of Conservation, and 40-year history of an organization and 37 years in California. We are always seeking out a long-term sustainable funding source. And you can tell by the per capita of 11 cents in California, we haven't gotten where we need to go yet, but the Sustainable Ag Lands Conservation Program, which we are also a pivotal player in creating, really did move the needle. And that has been in place since 2014. So that is always our long-term goal from a policy perspective. And of course, we also promote a lot of other policy work to promote sustainable funding sources for conservation programs like the Healthy Soils Program and other climate smart agricultural programs that have a direct tie and complement to ag conservation easements.
Yeah, I think that's, excuse me.
No, I was just going to ask Katie or Michael, do you have anything to add?
I would add, and that, as Kara said, we're really looking at this in the long range, with the messaging that we're hearing, in our involvement with, state agencies, and it's been a pretty steady drumbeat over the last year, is, trying to crack the nut on public-private funding partnerships. I think it was alluded to the executive order that was released a few weeks ago, and what does that do for land conservation? Well, there wasn't money tied to that action by the governor, and we know that we are in a critical place with our California state budget. So funding, from the state level is going to be very difficult to come by unless it comes in the version of a bond or another external fee of some sort. So the challenge is upon many of us, that want to see more robust funding sources to really get in there and to engage and figure out how can we create better linkages and how can we message appropriately with some of our outside funding opportunity, points, whether it be private foundations, whether it be corporations, to really, bridge, folks and those dollars, because they are critical, to this good work. And I think we've demonstrated that this work is worthy and can really do wonderful, community-wide benefits when put in practice. So I think, it sells itself, but unfortunately we have to go out and get more folks interested in this around the table, and to really see if we can build a resilient and durable public-private partnership that could be a model elsewhere.
I would only add that to those great answers, that when you're, for our perspective, and looking for funding to acquire conservation easements, that being dependent upon bonds and the will of those that are creating those bonds and the voters for approving them, that's a tough thing to depend on every year. And there's, one would have to wonder just what's the appetite for California voters to continue to pass, especially some of these larger bonds. That, combined with being at the will of the legislature and annual appropriations, particularly in years like this when the budgets are very tight, having a dependable, predictable funding source would go a long, long way into helping us get and achieve this conservation goals that we have. The governor's 30 by 30 goals, as we've talked a little bit about it, is really undefined at this point. But however we define that, trying to achieve that without a commitment of the funding support is going to be really difficult. So we're happy that there's a goal out there and that there's an interest and a desire to conserve these working lands, but there has to be that has to be met with a strong funding source to get it done. Like, so we just Rangeland Trust alone, with our 200,000 acres on this waiting list, theoretically speaking, we can conserve right away and close those projects and add to that goal. But the only way we can do it is if we have a good funding source.
All right, we just have a couple minutes left, but I want to make sure we get to this last question. And I want to give Kara and Michael a chance to answer, but Kara, we'll start with you. Sheila says, I have more time than money. So my question is, how can I help in my small grassroots way?
Wow, that's so great to have someone that wants to, that's a nice question to end on. Let me think about that. I have to kind of, re-engineer where my brain's at right now. I think that a big thing in California that I have thought about since I started in this position 3 years ago is we were beating the drum. We're losing 50,000 acres a year. And to me, whatever we're saying isn't quite working yet. I think, and I say this a lot, the public can drive for hours in California and see miles and miles of agriculture. And probably until the pandemic can still go to the grocery store any time of year and get everything they need and want. So there's a real disconnect still with the public about how productive our agricultural land is and how much we have here and how much losing it will do to us. So I think how you can help is to become a member of American Farmland Trust and help get the word out. Get your No Farms, No Food bumper sticker. Help get the word out to the general public in your community about the values that agricultural land provides. And then if you want to go deeper and work on more programmatic work and be an intern or someone like that, that would be helpful. But I think just bridging the gap between those of us in the know and the general public is really what we need to do to accelerate protecting our ag land.
Yeah, of course, as nonprofits, we always welcome those contributions. That's what keeps our doors open. But what doesn't cost any money is the advocacy.
Yeah.
It doesn't cost anything to pick up the phone and call your elected officials. It doesn't cost but 50 cents to send a letter off if you want to do it that way, or an email. It doesn't cost anything. Having them hear from you how important it is to you that these conservation programs continue, that's invaluable. That's important to us as it is important to you. And if you think back to Abby's question earlier today about the challenge she has of talking to her colleagues and her classmates, tell that story. Help us tell that story. Both AFT and CRT are barking on and increasing our outreach efforts. You can be a big part of that just by talking to your friends and neighbors and family and just say, hey, this is what we learned today. This is how important this work is. Join me. And they can advocate as well. Doesn't cost a thing.
I would just add one more thing. It's that local planning, because we have a former county supervisor in our midst here, right? So I think it's important to really, get to know your general plan, get to know your planning processes, get to know your community development, directors and what their visions are, in major key areas where you can do planning around agriculture, and really ask the questions that are, looking at climate, looking at, ag protection of land resources, and just knowing that, because most of this happens, in a really intensely local place.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining our webinar. We are out of time, but we will be sure to send the webinar link of the recording out to everyone, along with links to both CRT's research and AFT's research. So thank you everyone, and we hope you have a great rest of the day.